I also want to thank all of you for coming today and for our speakers and making the time, as Tomer said, in a tight schedule and joining us today. I'm privileged to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Rainer Baubock. Professor Baubock holds a chair in social and political theory at the Department of Political and Social Sciences of the European University Institute. From 1986 to 1999, he was a researcher and associate professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. He taught regularly at the universities of Vienna and Innsbruck and was a recurrent visiting professor at the Central European University of Budapest. He was also a guest professor at various universities, including the Bellagio Center of the Rockefeller Foundation, Yale University, and Princeton University. From 2003 until 2005, he was the president of the Austrian Association of Political Science. He has won recognition in various forms. To mention just 3 examples, in 2006, he was awarded the Latsis Prize of the European Science Foundation for his work on immigration and social cohesion in modern societies. In 2013, he was elected corresponding member abroad of the Austrian Academy of Science. And also in 2013, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by Malmö University. His research interests include normative political theory, democratic citizenship, European integration, nationalism, minority rights, and of course, migration. He is the co-coordinator of EUDO, EU Democracy Observatory on Citizenship, which is the largest online observatory on citizenship and voting rights. Apart from coordinating this huge project and from teaching various seminars, Professor Baubock wrote and edited various books on these topics, both in English and in German, including his groundbreaking and still very relevant today 1994 book titled Transnational Citizenship, Membership and Rights in International Migration. His forthcoming book on democratic inclusion is a dialogue with some of the most prominent thinkers in the field, including Joseph Cairns, David Miller, David Owen, and Will Kymlicka, among others. Reflecting his interdisciplinarity, he has published a countless numbers of articles, believe me, I tried to count them, in leading journals and edited books in different fields, including political thought, comparative politics, philosophy, law, migration studies, and European studies. He is also part of the editorial boards of several of these journals dealing with these topics, including Migration Studies, Citizenship Studies, and Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. Today, we are privileged to have him as our keynote speaker, as I said. His lecture will be based on an article which will be published in Journal of Common Market Studies, titled Refugee Protection and Burden Sharing in the European Union. Professor Baubock, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shani, for this very generous and much too long introduction. And thanks to the Minerva Center and to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for having me here. As you may have thought while listening to Shani, I'm not an obvious candidate for this talk because actually I've written very little on issues of refugee policies and asylum law. I'm an expert on citizenship, democracy, yes, migration, but that's not the same thing as refugee issues. I happen to have written this forthcoming article because I felt in 2015 sometimes you have to talk about issues where you don't feel you're on solid ground because you have not worked on them before. They just catch up with you and they force you to take a stance. So this is my weak attempt to think about refugee issues from a political theory perspective. And I still have some trepidations, especially in this audience and among these other speakers, all of whom are experts. Migration lawyers, practitioners, NGO representatives. You know much more about this topic than I ever will know. But I take the privilege of taking a distance stance as a political philosopher on the moral principles behind the law and the policies. And this is what I will be talking about here today. There should be a handout that has been circulated. So I decided at the last minute not to show you my text-heavy slides. You have them all there in these copies. I will just talk about them and maybe show only one single table. And I will also try to discipline myself not to exceed my 40 minutes. Maybe keep it even shorter in order to leave time for the Q&A. So my talk will be mostly focused on state duties in long-term admission and integration of asylum seekers. That means I'm leaving aside a lot and very important issues, such as how do we define refugees in the first place. There is a big debate in Europe about mixed motives of asylum seekers and mixed flows. So how do we distinguish between economically motivated migrants and those who have genuine claims to be refugees? And is it always possible to make these distinctions in a neat and clean way? And I think it isn't. I'll leave that aside. Secondly, I leave aside the big debate about alternatives to asylum in refugee protection, such as why don't states make more humanitarian interventions to deal with the root causes that produce the refugees? Why don't they create more protected zones where people can stay close to countries of origin and invest into these zones where actually most refugees are currently hosted? They are not hosted in the European destination states. What about the statuses alternative to asylum, such as temporary protection, which was widely used after the breakup of Yugoslavia in Europe in the early 1990s, but is not a dominant response now towards the Syrian refugees? And what about resettlement as an alternative to asylum? So taking refugees directly out of the countries next to where they fled from and resettling them in destination states. All of this very important, not the topic of my talk. I assume that even if you have answered all of these questions, there will still remain a very sizable number of people who take the route of asylum in order to gain protection as refugees and who have a genuine claim to be recognized as refugees. So the puzzle I will be addressing at the very end of my talk is about the European Union. The upshot of what I'm going to say is that the European Union provides nearly optimal conditions for working out a fair regime of burden sharing in accommodating and accepting long-term refugees for resettlement. But it has miserably failed in living up to these expectations. There is an explanatory puzzle. Why is that the case? And maybe I have a couple of words to say on this. But I'm more interested in a normative question, which is, can we actually say that EU states, because they're members of the European Union, do have special duties that go beyond the general duties that states have as signatories of the Refugee Convention, as members of the international state system, to jointly build and individually comply with a European refugee protection system? And the answer to that will be yes, but they failed to meet these expectations. So let me start first with what political philosophers have been discussing widely, which is what kind of duty is the duty to protect refugees? And especially the moral philosophers among them tend to think about this as a humanitarian duty that is a bit similar, like if you walk by a pond and you see there is a child drowning out there in the pond, do you have a duty to rescue that child? And the general answer among moral philosophers is yes, of course, you have such a duty, especially if you can swim, right? So you don't have a duty to rescue the child if you risk to drown yourself. So there is a limit of costs. Secondly, you have the duty to rescue the child, but you don't necessarily have a duty to take in the child and adopt it and take it to your home. So there is also already a kind of hint at the possible limit to what humanitarian duties can do with regard to the protection of refugees. And a humanitarian view of the duty to protect refugees would be about the duty to rescue and protect individuals. It would not necessarily imply a duty to set up institutions that prevent people from drowning in that pond in the first place, such as a Baywatch system, for example. So all that suggests that thinking about a duty to protect refugees as a purely humanitarian duty is a limited perspective. It doesn't capture the nature of how we tend to think about the duty to protect refugees, which is more a human rights-based duty rather than just a humanitarian duty. what does it mean to say that refugee protection is a human rights-based duty? Well, on one hand, it means that human rights have become part of the cornerstone, the foundation of international law after World War II. And of course, here I'm preaching to the converted or carrying alls to Athens, you know, the Alls of Minerva. You're all aware that this is what human rights mean, and the refugee part of the international human rights body is a very significant one. If you look at the number of states that have signed or ratified the Geneva Refugee Convention or the 1967 New York Protocol, it's one of the most successful instruments in international human rights law. So there is a widespread commitment of states to treat this as a legal obligation beyond the general moral obligations that people have in a humanitarian way to rescue other people who are in dire straits in need. Now, let me suggest, and here I'm following broadly a political theorist from Southampton University, David Owen, who has published 2 articles on this question recently, that we should think about the human right to protect refugees as a matter of state legitimacy. What does it mean to speak about state legitimacy? State legitimacy can be seen as a function of 2 requirements. One is it's about mutual recognition of states. States recognize each other as sovereign states in the international state system. And secondly, there is a moral requirement that states need to protect the basic fundamental human rights of those who are subject to their authority, and that creates a basic stance of legitimacy in that international state system. Sorry. David Owen suggested, therefore, that what the problem with refugee protection is basically that it means that certain states have failed to live up to this expectation of state legitimacy because they either themselves generate refugees by persecuting people or by not protecting particular minorities, or there are states that lack the capacity to do so. So that would lead to a broader conception of refugees that also includes those who are victims of civil wars or emerge from failed states who don't maintain basic security in order for all their populations. So if one state fails to live up to the expectations that a legitimate state has to be capable, that's its reason for being recognized as a state, to protect human rights in its territory, then the idea is that state legitimacy, because it's based on mutual recognition, means that other states have to step in. And other states acquire a duty to make up for the failed human rights protection by any single state by stepping in and taking over responsibility for protecting the human rights of those people who have lost the human rights protection that is meant to be attached to their citizenship. If your citizenship no longer protects your human rights, then you have a claim to substitute protection by other states. Of course, the problem is it's a claim against all the other states out there. So the question is which particular state will be responsible for that, and I'll come to that in a minute. But let me again emphasize this point stressed by David Owen, that we should think about refugee protection as a legitimacy repair mechanism in the international state system rather than just as a humanitarian duty. So what are then the duties that states have in that context? And here I suggest to distinguish, as you will see on your handout, between general and special duties. Let me start with the special duties because they're easier to spell out in some ways. Special duties that states have towards specific particular refugees can be based, for example, on a state's involvement in a situation that generates refugees. So if a state intervenes in another state or backs an authoritarian regimes or sells its arms to that regime, then it's in a way causally responsible for the refugees that come out of that state. And that makes it very clear that this state has a particular responsibility towards those refugees from that state. So this is what you might want to call reparative duties that states have towards refugees from particular states. Secondly, states can also have special duties that are what I call identity-based. So a state may see itself as a protector state for a particular category of refugees that are persecuted because of their religious identities, because of their ethnic belonging. So the state may say, this is the religion that that is dominant in our territory, therefore we want to protect those who are persecuted on grounds of having that religion. Or this is the ethnicity that is dominant in this state, and therefore we want to protect those who have the same ethnicity out there. And of course, Israel and in the previous era, Germany used to be the paradigmatic example of these rationales of identity-based duties of special protection. And finally, there can be special duties that are neither of a reparative type nor identity-based, that I call positional. States may have special duties towards refugees just because they happen to be in a position, in the best possible position, to offer them initial protection. And usually this means they are proximate to the places where the refugees originate from. So if an asylum seeker, lands on the coast or crosses a border, then it is indeed the case that that state has a prima facie responsibility to look at that person, to provide immediate help, and also to help determine whether that person is a refugee that ought to have international recognition. That can also mean sometimes that these states have positional duties to provide temporary protection in a situation of mass refugee movements, where people actually have a desire to go back as soon as they can when the crisis is over, rather than to be resettled in faraway territories. So sometimes these positional duties they lead to unfair distribution of burdens between states, but it would be blinding ourselves to the realities and needs of refugee protection in denying that these are special duties indeed. Now, next to these special duties, there are categories of general duties that states have as members of the international state system, independently of any of the three reasons that I have just mentioned. And these general duties can be spelled out as three. The first duty is not to generate refugees, to effectively protect human rights in your territory in such a way that your state doesn't become a refugee-generating state. This is the primary duty. The secondary duty is, if there are refugees produced by other states, states have a general duty to cooperate in the international system with all other states in order to provide global protection to refugees. And thirdly, and that's the most contested part, they have a tertiary duty. If some states that are not themselves producing refugees fail to comply with the global duty to maintain a global protection regime, then the remaining states still have a tertiary duty to take up the slack, as it's called among the political philosophers. That means to make good for what states don't do that have a duty to do it. The overall goal of general duties towards refugees ought to be to provide effective protection for the largest numbers of refugees in the world overall. There is no reason to say that once we've dealt with the special duties, then the job is already done. A serious commitment to see refugee protection as an international legitimacy repair mechanism means we have to look at refugees and in a way provide them the best possible opportunity, all of them, to receive effective protection. Now, imagine now two different types of regimes, one in which there was only special duties that are recognized, right? What would happen then is the refugees would have hugely unequal chances to receive protection. Some of them, because they're close by to a state that can host them, because they have identity that relate to it as destination state, or a state that was causally involved recognizes its reparative duties, as, for example, the US and France did after the Indochinese boat people crisis. They might be among the lucky ones, but others that fall into neither of these categories will be just lost out and will find no state that is willing to take them in. So a purely special duty regime is obviously globally unjust because it doesn't meet the requirement to provide effective protection to the largest possible numbers. Now, on the other hand, a purely general duty regime, I want to suggest, is also highly problematic. Why is that the case? because if you completely ignored the special duties and said, well, let's have the overall numbers of refugees and let's just distribute them across the world according to some criteria of fairness between states, what would happen is that the special responsibilities of states towards those people would be minimized, and states would be less willing to comply with such a system than they would be if they recognize some kind of special duties. And the refugees themselves would probably also suffer, because the integration prospects of those refugees that are randomly distributed are probably worse than those that have some kind of special links to destination states. So this is why I think some kind of mixed system, where both the general duties and the special duties are combined and recognized as part of a global regime, is the best one to achieve the overall goal of maximum protection of the largest numbers. Now, here is the only slide that I want to show you. And this is this little table that maybe needs some explanation. Ever since John Rawls, political philosophers tend to think about ideal and non-ideal worlds. And I think the topic of refugee protection lends itself to do this exercise. But the distinction between ideal and non-ideal world is not a dichotomous one. You know, it's not just here is a utopia in which there wouldn't be any refugees anyway, because all states would meet the primary duty not to generate refugees. And the real world, which is the messy world that we know. But there are many stages in between, and we ought to think about these stages in between and how we can move closer to an ideal world. So, in an ideal world, there are no refugees. One step below, you can imagine a world in which all non-refugee generating states would comply fully with their secondary duties to take in refugees and to contribute to global protection. In that situation, you would still need some coordination between states. You would need something like the UNHCR that kind of figures out, you know, which state does what. But it would be easy, because all states would be willing to do their bit, right? It would be just a coordination task rather than an enforcement task. If you go one step below and assume that all states that don't generate refugees are willing to comply with their secondary duties, but only partially so. So they want to do less, and if not all states do enough, then they want to do even less. But they want to do their bit in some way. So what you would need in that kind of situation is coordination plus some kind of enforcement mechanism. Otherwise, you couldn't live up to the goal of protecting the maximum numbers in the most effective way. And finally, and this is what I suggest is the real world, in a world in which many non-refugee generating states do not comply with their secondary duties to participate in a global protection regime, you get the tertiary duty to take up the slacks for those states that don't meet their secondary duties. And what you need then is a coalition of the willing, in a way, that are willing to cooperate with the UNHCR, that do their bit even if other states don't, and that don't take the excuse that we don't do it if not everybody does it, right? In a completely non-ideal world, you would have compliance of states only with humanitarian and special duties, but there would be no international coordination at all. And I'm suggesting we are not in that type of non-ideal world. We do have at least an aspiration of international coordination, but the aspiration is under the auspices or the context where many states don't comply at all, and therefore you have to build coalitions of the willing states, and the UNHCR and other agencies have the thankless task of building these coalitions in an ad hoc way from the scratch in every new refugee crisis to see which states are willing to take up the slack and to do their bit. Now, let me look again into this complex and puzzling duty to take up the slack, to do more than one's fair share because others don't do it, right? So moral philosophers have been slightly puzzled about this. How can I ever have a duty to do more than my fair share, right? Wouldn't that be just what philosophers call supererogatory? That means, yeah, I'm a kind of moral hero if I do it. But you cannot force me to do it. There is, that's not possible. Well, you know, in the recent article that I couldn't take into account in my piece because it was written earlier, Sofia Stemplovska argues there is a moral duty to take up the slack in response to dire need and at reasonable costs. Right? Under these two conditions, you can say that states are actually morally obliged to do what other states don't. And she also says, and I completely agree with this, the point of this is to say that there is the priority of a duty towards refugees over a duty of fairness among states. If you turn this around, you would say, I have a duty to do my bit only if everybody else does. This is what fairness between states means. If you follow that logic, then that means you no longer pursue the goal of maximum effective protection of maximum numbers of refugees. You're just concerned about fairness between states. If you turn it around and say we are concerned with justice towards refugees, then fairness of states is a second consideration, not a first consideration, and therefore there can be such a tertiary duty to take up the slack. And I think, so how far does this duty go? Some people have suggested, like David Miller, that yes, there may be such a moral duty, but since he believes that states are sovereign as nation states, it is for each state to determine its own fair share and to count and states may even count refugees within their overall immigration quota. So states ought to think seriously what they want to do for refugees, knowing that not all the other states will be willing to do what they ought to do, but they are still completely free to do it for themselves. So it's not something that can be imposed from them, on them from the outside. And this is why Miller thinks, yes, duty to take up the slack, but lots of tragic conflicts will arise because sometimes the costs just become overwhelming for states and they've already set their immigration quota, and if that quota is filled by refugees, then there is no duty to take in more refugees than this because they have a right to control the overall numbers of immigrants into their territory. At the other end of the spectrum, David Owen says, since the duty towards refugees are duties of legitimacy repair in the state system, they are not diminished at all if few states participate. The answer to Owen's position is, you hear it all the time in political discourse. Well, imagine that it's only us left over and all the other states don't do anything. Our country cannot possibly take in all the world's refugees. That's a standard rhetorical trope that you hear again and again. Well, on my view, if you take that seriously, well, that's pretty much undeniable because of the reasonable cost limitation to tertiary duties to take up the slack. However, if you think that tertiary duties arise if you have a coalition of the willing, right, that mutually meet the criteria of recognition of legitimacy because they are willing to protect human rights in the global system out there at large, then depending on how large that coalition of the willing is and how large the number of refugees is that have to be taken care of, there is still a reasonable prospect that there will be a global refugee protection regime supported by a sufficient number of states who do have that duty, even if other states fail to do it. The big dilemma is, from a moral perspective, such a duty is an enforceable one. Just like the duty to rescue the drowning child from the pond. In some countries that's part of a legal obligation that people have. In other countries it's not a legal obligation. But morally speaking, it's legitimate to turn it into a legal obligation and to make it enforceable so people can be punished for not rescuing a child if they can do so because they have the capacity to do it, right? The problem is, if you build global refugee protection on the idea of a coalition of willing states and you turn this into an enforceable duty, then the very mechanism of establishing enforcement mechanisms will deter states from joining the coalition, right? So you have what I call, and that's not in the paper, an enforcement dilemma, right, in coalition building. The moral legitimacy is there, but the enforcement mechanism deters states from joining such a coalition. Now, that brings me then eventually to the EU, where I think this dilemma can be resolved. But before I come there, let me briefly address another question, which is how do we determine what the contribution of each state ought to be in such a global protection regime. Many people have suggested these general duties to take in refugees to whom you don't have a special relation, right, should be based on states' integration capacities for refugees. How do you measure integration capacities? There are two criteria that are pretty much uncontested. These are wealth, as measured, for example, by GDP per capita, and size, the size of the population generally. So the larger the state and the wealthier the state, the greater is its duty to take in a share of the global refugee population. Some people have suggested additional criteria, such as territory rather than population. Australia has lots of empty territory. Does it mean it has a greater duty to take in refugees and to resettle them in a territory? The Netherlands are an overcrowded territory. So does it mean there are fewer duties to take in refugees? Here I have my doubts. Refugees are not settlers. They are not colonizers. They are not looking out for territory. They are looking out for jobs in labor markets. They need housing. They need education for their kids. They need a social life in another society. And that means higher population density is very often what attracts refugees to particular countries rather than empty territories. And giving them empty territories rather than resettling them in societies that can accommodate them also as settled immigrants in the long run doesn't seem to me such a good idea. Secondly, there is the idea that states that have taken in many immigrants, economic migrants, have lesser duties to take in refugees because they already have a large share of a foreign population. This is David Miller's argument, for example. Here again, I have strong doubts about this. Why? Because having a larger immigrant population actually helps with integration of refugees. It's not something that makes it more difficult. If you have a large immigrant population, it means your society is more diverse. Your labor market is more diverse. There are more jobs for additional immigrants out there. Societies have learned to cope with diversity in a way that homogeneous societies with very few immigrants find very difficult. So taking into account the share of the immigrants in the total population as an argument against refugee intake, again, seems to me to ignore that what refugees need is not just temporary protection. They need the prospect of integration and resettlement in a society that can take in immigrants. Okay, the big question is what to do about refugee preferences and state preferences. Some refugees want to go to particular destinations, and some states have a preference for particular kinds of refugees. Should we take this into account as well with the global redistribution regime of refugees? And my answer is not as a moral claim, but for pragmatic reasons, yes. If refugees have a preference for a particular destination and that destination is willing to accept them, that again is something that obviously enhances the prospects of their integration in that society. Being sent to a country where you don't want to go and that doesn't want to have you is not a good starting point for long-term refugee protection. So it should count, but not as a moral claim to choose your own destination. It should count within a scheme that says, here is a pool of refugees, here is a pool of destination states, how do we allocate the refugees to this pool? And then refugees' choices should count to a certain extent, just as much as state preferences should count to a certain extent. If they say, this is a skill that we actually need, that probably helps in finding out which refugees fit which states. So matching states and refugees is generally, for pragmatic reasons, not a bad idea, whereas a random distribution might very often, for pragmatic reasons, be a bad idea. So how can we fit in all this in a general regime? There is one more consideration that we have to take, which is states can contribute to global refugee protection in two ways. They can either take in refugees, or they can pay money to other states that take in refugees. So in a global regime, there may be some way to substitute refugee intake and resource contributions to that global regime. And this is an idea that has been explored since the 1990s, a pioneering article by Peter Schack on tradable refugee quota that I was initially very resistant to accept, and many moral philosophers do reject it, but I think it makes sense if you think about it hard enough and if you work it out in a certain way. The initial starting point, and this is very important, is you first need a mandatory scheme among the participating states that determines the initial quota. You know, that's not a matter of negotiation according to state preferences. You say an amount of contributions has to be fixed according to the wealth and the size, the population size of states. Once you have set these quota, according to that scheme, states can then start to trade and can say, well, I'm willing to take more refugees than I would have been assigned under this initial quota. But I need support. Where does the support come from? The support comes from other states who are willing to take in fewer refugees. And if states trade these quota in a free market, basically the costs of exclusionary preferences will be equivalent to the additional costs that states have for taking in more than they have been initially assigned. That's the point of an equilibrium price mechanism in such a market. So it doesn't seem to be entirely unfair to have such a system. And that system, and that has been recently suggested by some economists, could actually be combined with a matching mechanism. The refugees can articulate their preferences to go to certain states, and states can articulate their preferences for certain refugees, and then you have a matching market. And not everybody gets their first preference, neither the states nor the refugees, but you try to allocate as good as you can according to these preferences. What is very important is, if you do that, you need to rule out discriminatory preferences. For example, we don't take in people of a certain color or of a certain religion. You have to say what counts as invidious discrimination. Once you have set this aside, there may be an acceptable range of preferences that could be taken into account, and actually the overall working of these tradable quota systems where contributions can substitute for intake and of matching mechanisms may be ideally that many more refugees will receive effective protection than under any other possible imaginable regime. So the regime seems to meet that requirement that I've initially set out, that this is the goal of refugee protection, to maximize the numbers who get effective protection and long-term integration. What's the objection against it? The objection is commodification. You treat refugees like carbon emissions, like a global bad rather than a global good. But I think this is philosophically confused, because what the mechanism actually does is it penalizes states who want to take in fewer refugees than they would have been assigned under a globally fair scheme. They have to pay, and they have to pay to those states that take in more refugees. So it's not that the refugees themselves are commodified. In a way, the commodification is the preferences of states. And it's a system of rewards and of sanctions that works out in that scheme. So I have been convinced in the end that this scheme would work in a world where there is a coalition of the willing in which these initial quota can be actually imposed and enforced. The problem is, and that's my remaining 6 minutes, it doesn't work in the world out there because of the enforcement dilemma that I've spelled out a while ago. How would states be willing to join such a system if you tell them that you cannot choose your initial quota, it will be assigned to you, and then you do your bit, and only then you can trade and bring in your preferences? There is a big deterrence out there to join such a scheme. And this is why we have the refugee regime that we have, ad hoc coalitions built through international mediation efforts by UNHCR and others. Now, look at the EU. The EU is not the international system of states. The EU is a polity that has, in a way, plays a reiterated cooperation game. You might say it's a prisoner's dilemma game, but it's a prisoner's dilemma game that is played again and again among the same partners. And economists will tell you that's the condition under which you can overcome the trap of the prisoner's dilemma, because all the states have a rational interest to cooperate, and they even have the institutions that will tell them what they have to do in order to realize that long-term interest they have in stable cooperation among the same set of states. If you look at the EU, the legal and political framework is there for enforceable duties among all the member states. You have the solidarity principle spelled out ever since the Amsterdam Treaty and the Tampere Council conclusions of 1999. It's there in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union in several articles. You have a series of directives on refugee protection that were already in place before the so-called crisis of 2015. And very importantly, what happens in the EU is that if asylum seekers arrive in an EU state, it's not the case that they enter just this particular nation state. They don't just enter Greece, they don't just enter Italy, they effectively enter EU territory. Why that? Because there's joint border control, there is an agency called Frontex that is involved in this, and you have open internal Schengen borders after this. So the states that they initially enter, have open borders towards other destination states, which makes it very clear that these people enter a much larger territory in which they have a range of possible alternative destinations in the end. It's not obvious that the positional duties of Greece and of Italy and in earlier times of Spain come along with the duty to be the long-term hosts that keep these refugees forever and integrate them into their societies. It's much more obvious from a Greek and Italian perspective to say that these are people that have entered our territory. We have duties to register them. We have duties to start a process of asylum determination. But we don't have the duty to keep all these refugees and to integrate them into our societies. It's an EU duty that falls on all the member states. So why did this not happen? Why did EU coordination fail? The short answer is Dublin, the Dublin regulation system that turned the positional duties of the first state where people can claim asylum and can be safe into a general duty to deal with these refugees on a long-term basis. And if that is in place, that means all the other destination states have an incentive to say that we send back people to those first countries and you are in charge of them and we are not. And if we are in charge, it's on a voluntary basis. You can't put this burden on us through an enforcement mechanism. Secondly, there is a failure to bring about shared norms. In spite of these sets of directives and the Dublin regulation, if you look at the recognition rates of asylum seekers from the same origin in the various EU countries, you will see how they differ. Even Syrian refugees in some countries have a recognition rate of 40%, whereas in other countries it's close to 90 and plus. So if you have these discrepancies between states, it's obvious that a state that has a recognition rate of Syrian refugees for 40% will not accept relocation of Syrian refugees from a state that has a recognition rate of 90%, because it's undermining its own policy. So you need a sharing of norms in order for a cooperation system to work, and that's still not there. And then you have Schengen, which in fact incentivizes the first states of asylum to pass on the refugees to other destination states. So in the end, what the EU system had and what made it fail is diverging interest between frontline, transition, destination, and bystander states that led to unilateral actions such as the closure of the Balkan route, border fences, and temporary suspension of Schengen, and we are going to see how temporary that is going to be. All of this subverted compliance with the relocation scheme that the EU did adopt, but that some states now openly say they won't comply with. Also, they are legally bound to accept it because they were part of the council decision that took it. So let me come to my conclusions in the last minute that I have. The conditions for cooperative solutions, even in an ideal case like the EU, are the sharing of norms, the willingness to distribute funds, and to distribute refugees. This is how Gregor Noll has spelled it out already some time ago. These three conditions must be in place, and they were not fully in place in the EU. Sharing of norms means uniform standards for asylum determination and baseline standards, at least, for refugee integration. Distribution of funds and refugees means relocation that equalizes member states' contributions in relation to capacities and that is sensitive to state and asylum seeker preferences, with the current relocation scheme in the EU is not. No, it's a kind of mechanism that is blind to these possible ways of adapting to states' preferences, including the trading that would solicit funds from the states that don't comply and transfer them to those states that do what they have to do. Okay. What in the end you have to do in order to get out of that trap is to replace Dublin with a system of multi-level division of responsibility, where the registration and adjudication of asylum claims does happen in the first country of asylum, but where there's a mandatory participation in an EU relocation scheme after that. This is the aspiration of the future. I think it's not completely off the table, but what I've heard about the plans of reforming the Dublin regulation makes me rather pessimistic that we are going to get there. Thank you for your attention.
But I guess you hear me. I think we have at least 15 minutes or 20 minutes for discussion. So, Avner, up with you. We can either collect or click on what you prefer, Hannah.
I'm fine with collecting. Since I've talked for long, you know, the audience should have a chance to ask.
Okay. Avner?
Yeah.
Avner.
No, maybe the two after. Thank you very much. This was fascinating, very important and timely and thought-provoking. One of the special duties that you mentioned was the fact that the state is best the position of duty. The state is in the best position to accept the refugees, and I wanted to suggest that there were two problems there. Okay? The first one is that you could think about a state being in the best position in two ways. One, social, and the other, economical. By social, I mean that today's refugees tend to immigrate to the place where there are already people who speak their language or the relatives and so on. They prefer to go to these places rather than to places where there are already jobs for them. And not in this, it is not necessarily the case that a state that where there are already many Bangladeshi or Syrians can also offer a lot of jobs. It could be the case that a very different state can offer more jobs. And in fact, the point is that the more they go to the state which is best socially positioned to accept them, the more it is the case that this state becomes less available to offer them jobs, because more jobs have been given to the previous refugees. Now more refugees are coming to the same place, and it becomes less positional, whatever the word, to offer them a job. So that's one issue. And the other one is that, and this was given to me in Thessaloniki, where I interviewed people in 2015, when so many Syrians were coming. They were saying that they suffered, well, they didn't use the term, but they were suffering from brute luck. Because they were in the positional situation to offer shelter to the refugees, because they were closer to the refugees than any other place, you know, the Dublin issue. And they were saying, it's not only that why should we suffer because of this brute luck that we are close to Syria and Libya and all these places. They were saying something more than that. They were saying that this contradicts, in your terms, the special duty that a state that was involved has to now offer, in creating the situation, now has to offer shelter. They were saying it's this North Europe which is responsible for creating this situation, and South Europe suffers from the need to give them shelter. So what I'm saying is that these two special duties contradict each other, or at least might be intentional.
Okay, big questions, but yeah, let's take one more.
Okay, thanks very much. So we'll be seeing that. So I've got one kind of comment or information slide and then two questions. So on the relocation, because I think the point you make about enforcement more generally is sound, of course, but I think there is a test right now of whether the EU would be able to enforce its own decisions. And so there is an infringement proceedings that just started against Hungary, Czechia, and Poland, precisely on their unwillingness to implement the relocation scheme. There is, in parallel, also there are two cases pending before the Court of Justice brought by Slovakia and Hungary, challenging the legality of that relocation scheme. So I think we're in territory where we don't know whether this attempt to have an emergency scheme, which is sort of based on Article 78.3, if it ends up being successful in some way following enforcement, then leading to a permanent scheme, then we can debate whether the permanent scheme follows the mechanism you propose, and it does to some extent, and it doesn't in other dimensions, but that is at least where the Commission is heading. So I think that's kind of still a question mark. But then I had two questions. So one which is kind of minor, but is, you know, the devil's advocate on the point about immigration, kind of your response to saying that states that are homogenous are actually less likely to be able to absorb refugees, whereas states like the UK, which has absorbed many immigrants, are more capable. In a sense, that is precisely the argument Hungary and Poland and others are making. They're saying we are homogenous, we are a homogenous society, we are a Christian society, and hence we can't take in anyone. So I think there's at the very least there's a risk in that line of argument. The more fundamental question I had kind of links the positional and or the special duties and the general duties, and that's the question of whether there is actually not just in terms of the realpolitik of, say, an organization like the EU being differently positioned than the global regime, but whether there is a point in saying that there is that layer of regionalism where burden sharing mechanisms can work better than on a global level, whether that's some sort of a mid-level between the positional saying it's just a proximity to the situation and saying this is a global duty of all states towards one another based on the UN Charter and other international documents, saying actually regional organizations often tend to have norm-sharing capacities as well. I mean, that happens in the OAS, it happens in Asia, that happens to some extent in the OAU, and certainly in the EU, and so that can generate that cooperation better than something global.
Okay. Thanks. Can I answer those two? Well,
Yeah.
you're the chair. You have to tell me
No,
what I
there,
said.
there are more questions from the audience, but if you want to...
Yeah, I think I'll start with those because these were already 4 questions and fairly big ones. Okay, on the first one, the positional duty I was talking about was in a way meant geographical rather than social and economic. The idea is states have duties just because they happen to be close to a refugee crisis zone, and therefore it's more likely that refugees will end up at their borders or shores. And the question is, do they have special duties just because of this? And some global justice theorists would say no, because that's brute luck, you know. And brute luck, according to luck egalitarianism, which is one of those theories, should be compensated for, right? So, in a refugee situation, it's individual people who need immediate protection, and this is what they get because the states in their vicinity are able to provide it to them, and if they're willing to do so. So there is a duty to rescue the drowning people when you happen to be the person walking past the pond, which is again your brute luck. But it is not a duty to take in that person into your home, you know. And that's exactly the difference I want to make. The positional duty is a duty to immediate assistance, rescuing people, for example, at sea, and a duty to start a determination procedure whether these are refugees or not. And then, after this, the general duty kicks in order to determine whether that is the state where these people should stay or whether it's other states. The social and economic capacity to take in refugees. This is something that I want to count as determining the initial fair distributions between states as far as wealth and size of population is concerned, whereas with regard to the number of immigrants you have had in the past, the quality of your job market, things like this is something that I would say has to be neutralized. So I'm not saying if you have had more immigrants in the past, you have to take in more refugees. I'm just saying it's not a reason why you should take fewer refugees. It should be neutralized. It should be evened out and not become part of determining the fair quota. It becomes, however, part at a later stage, once you have determined initial fair quota and then you start trading between states. Then what happens is that a state like Hungary that says we are so homogeneous, which is, by the way, a myth, right? But let's say, for the sake of argument, let's accept that they are homogeneous and we don't know how to integrate refugees, so therefore we don't take any. Well, that's fair enough. You had an initial quota where you were supposed to take in 10,000 refugees. You say you cannot integrate those, so finance the 10,000 refugees will be integrated somewhere else. And the cost of doing so will be exactly equivalent to the cost that your exclusion preferences imposes on the other states in the scheme. And then that's a fair solution. So this is how it comes in, not by lowering their quota, because the quota of the contribution they have to make always remains the same. But by saying how much of this contribution will be done through refugee intake and how much of this will be done through contributions of resources that go to other states. So in a way, I've answered both of these questions now. Ruby's other point about the current test, whether the EU is able to establish a permanent scheme. Yes, indeed. Let's watch that space. I'm still hopeful. You know, the EU is a machinery that grinds slowly towards eventually generally progressive outcomes. So we can be reasonably optimistic that after the Court of Justice has decided and infringement procedures have been done, there might be, hopefully, a confirmation that this was a legal move to make, and therefore other states have to comply with it. That still does not deal with the major cause of the problem, which is the Dublin regulation and the way the relocation scheme has been designed, which is in a way top-down imposition of refugee quota that cannot be traded, and their preferences don't count, which is, to my mind, the worst possible way of doing it. So that just the Commission should have listened to advice that there might be better design systems that make it easier for states to comply and to deal with greater numbers. The layer of regionalism, yes, I think that's not just an EU story. I've told it just as an EU story, but there are other regional integration regimes that could work in a similar way. And the point is, ideally you might say, why don't we have a club of all stable democracies that form the coalition of the willing, that impose on themselves the obligation to deal with the general duties? That would be a nice way of handling it, you know, a kind of Kantian world confederation of republics. I think there are good reasons why the regionalist approach is the better one, and one of the reasons is that if you have regional integration, it means that sovereignty has already been softened, as it has in the EU, and the territory becomes a broader territory, as I've already mentioned for the EU. And therefore it's more likely that states will understand the logic that these refugees have to be distributed within that common space, rather than if you do it between Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and Canada, which will make the logic just based on we are all democracies committed to protecting human rights. But it's not clear that the same refugees would go either to New Zealand or to Scandinavia.
Okay, Yael.
You said that one of the problems of burden sharing is the status of quota. And I was thinking, while you were talking, I was thinking about the Paris agreements.
About, sorry?
Paris agreements.
Yeah.
And how they build some kind of shaming mechanism to make countries increase their own quota in the prospect of actually increasing that again in the future. And I wonder, I mean, global warming and refugees are both not very sexy issues, and they manage to do that somehow. And I wonder what can we learn from that.
Stefan?
I have two short comments and one question. This proximity argument, of course, my main presentation is about that. it is the way I understand it is that you're making a temporal argument rather than putting a hierarchy of responsibility when posing this argument, proximity argument. So I think it's conducive to being misunderstood by states who would like to avoid responsibility. So I think that's one has to be very careful about posing that argument. The other thing is about this demographic thing, homogeneity and diversity argument. That's an interesting case because some states may also try to avoid responsibility because they are diverse, because they are also more careful about their demography, such as after the Gulf War, Turkey admitted some Kurds, and then we had some demographic and some ethnic clashes in the region. So that's also one argument that you have to think about. Lastly, you mentioned about safe zones at the beginning. You didn't elaborate on that, but I think it's important because it's becoming a preference for some countries like Turkey. In that case, I have this question mark in my mind because those safe zones are going to be within the borders of the conflicting state or the state of origin, which means no other state will be taking the responsibility. There will be lack of sovereign responsibility in that area. So I wonder, isn't it going to be having the same deficiencies of general global responsibility that you mentioned, that states are less willing to take responsibility if we establish such safe zones? What do you think about that? Thank you.
You want to take additional one? Or you want
One more.
to- Tomer.
Thanks. Well, it will be two, but yeah, maybe quickly, because I started off thinking of the positional arguments or positional consideration. And I was wondering how in your framework you take into account other actors that don't seem to be apparent in your framework, which is the middlemen. In other words, the smugglers, the traffickers, the industry of facilitating movement, which is sometimes influential of what the position actually is, right? And you don't have to be physically proximate, you have to be close enough to an airport or to a port, but from there, it's the smugglers who, they have preferences as well. So that's one question. And then the issue of refugee trading, or as you, I think, quite brilliantly reframed it as preference trading, the preferences of the state. So how, there seems to be a strong objection there would be moral hazard, or the moral hazard of those countries who are willing to pay to externalize the, which is a topic that we'll be talking about later on, I think, externalization considerations. And in that context, how would you assess the EU-Turkey agreement, which, it might be exposed, it's not within a regime, but it looks very much like what you were describing, right? Paying off a government to accept your refugees from your territory.
Yael was the first one, right? So I haven't, there are many questions now that come up that I haven't thought about it deeply and that I brushed aside initially, if you remember. So I'm not going to deal with this because that's the price if you do political theory. You have to abstract, in a way, many issues away in order to be able to answer any particular question at all. But they're all very stimulating for further thought. So I think one thing that might be different with the Paris Agreement and the current state of international protection regime of refugees is that in the Paris Agreement, finally, you got to the big size, the big numbers of states signing up. And that makes it easier, much easier, to create shaming mechanisms for states dropping out, even big ones, like the US, right? Can be maybe effectively shamed, but let's hope so. In earlier stages, of that global environmental and emission and carbon regime, it was much easier to think about the shaming mechanism. It's much more difficult, right? Because so few states were really seriously committed to these things. Now, in the refugee area, if you draw that parallel, as I said initially, you have large numbers of states that have signed the Refugee Convention or the New York Protocol. So you might say a same starting point. But the problem is, of course, that these instruments don't imply a global protection regime of the kind that I've sketched out. You know, they don't create duties of states to meet their general burdens, right? To take in refugees or to pay for the take-in in other states. So we need to get to that point first, you know, where a very large number of states is willing to sign up to that type of regime before you can think about effective shaming mechanisms against those states that are being left out. And again, in the EU, I think you have a close analog to this. There may be a possible outcome of effectively shaming the Visegrad states for backing out of a relocation scheme that was jointly decided by qualified majority in the Council and therefore is binding for them. So there should be a way of shaming these countries, and let's see how it goes. Right? Then the other set of questions raised by Bartram. Proximity, yes. Does it create a hazard of responsibility shirking by other states that are far away, right? They say the proximate states are responsible. That is the Dublin logic, you know? But it's a flawed logic because it confuses the positional duties, the special positional duties with the general duties that don't go away. So what I'm saying is some type of special duties, like the duties that are identity-based or reparation-based, quite obviously and naturally lead to a duty to take in refugees. In fact, you cannot substitute it even by paying others for doing it if you accept these kinds of duties. If you have just a positional duty because you happen to be close by, that means your intake, in a way, has to count against your duties under global refugee protection regime, and that means it doesn't diminish in any way the duties of other states to participate in a global general duty protection regime. So if you think it through, it's obvious that whatever Greece and Italy do in that regard doesn't detract from the duties of Germany, Sweden, Austria, let alone France and England and Britain, countries that have done much less. Those duties remain exactly the same, and then they should be articulated through duties to relocate or to contribute resources for an effective relocation in other places. The diversity argument against admission, yes, indeed. You know, this diversity can be invoked in both ways. You can say Canada is a very diverse society, therefore it's easier for Canada to take in refugees from no matter what origin, because there will already be an ethnic group there will be a labor market that helps them integrate quite well, etc. But you can also have countries that see diversity as a terrible fate imposed on them, you know, through flows that they could not control, like Canada controls its own immigration policy. And therefore it becomes a negative argument. Well, all of this can be dealt with if you accept the trading that I've suggested, because then whether diversity is a positive argument for taking in refugees or a negative argument against taking in refugees, it does not change your duty to participate in the global protection regime. It just changes on what you do, you know, of whether you meet that duty by taking in more refugees or whether you meet that duty by financing more intake by other states, right? The safe zones, well, safe zones inside the country that generates refugees is a very tricky matter on which I don't have enough expertise. I think there are big problems coming up. You know, what's the authority there? You know, is it the state that intervenes in humanitarian ways, or is it with the international community of states? How can you establish, you know, what is the legitimate authority that then takes care of the refugees in that place? But there is another policy that has been suggested also by some refugee experts, like Alex Betts, who says, well, however you deal with the asylum problem in Europe, the most important response quantitatively is to help the millions of people in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, yeah, to stay there and to build a reasonable life and to see themselves as future citizens of those countries. Rather than thinking only about the duties of the European states to take in these refugees. If you take, I wouldn't rule out that this is a plausible answer, because it might actually be also the strongest preference of many of the people, that they don't want to be resettled far away. And they feel easier to stay there, provided they are given good opportunities to build their lives there, which again would mean a huge investment coming from European states that says, we don't take in the refugees because they don't want to come to our place, and maybe we also don't want to have them, but we need to compensate the states that take in the refugees in a way that is not just about fairness between states, but about helping the largest numbers of refugees, which currently are in these 3 states in the Middle East. And therefore the compensation would be very large, much larger than anything envisaged under the EU-Turkey agreement, in order to make this an effective part of European integration policy. The Thomas question, the middleman industry. Yes, again, I had in the first version of this paper, I had a whole section on the messing up of the problems through the mixed flows and the involvement of traffickers and smugglers. And then reviewers told me, you cannot deal with this issue, even on 5 pages. Just cut it out, right? And stick to your main question, because of course, it does mess up things. But it basically just means there is a good reason why states want to attack the industry in a certain way, because it's not the most important reason that it creates positional duties for states that are not necessarily the proximate ones. The other reason is the terrible threats to the human lives of the people who have to rely on traffickers. But the answer is, how do you attack this industry? You attack the industry by creating alternative admission channels. You undercut their business not through security measures, because that will just increase the price that people have to pay in order to cross these barriers. You undercut the business. It's the same logic as with drug prohibition and drug trafficking. Right? You undercut the business if you create legal channels, right? That makes it impossible for illegal business to flourish. And the preference trading in the EU-Turkey case, yes, indeed. As I said before, paying off Turkey, I think, is not entirely unjustifiable if, and that's a big if, Turkey says, which it seems to say, Syrian refugees that are Sunni, it's not all refugees, it's Sunni Syrian refugees, right, are to a certain extent welcome. And there, as we talked yesterday over dinner, there might be even political motives, of the current regime to say, these are future voters that we want to have in the country, right? But if this is good for the effective protection of refugees, and they would even get fast access to Turkish citizenship, that might not be a bad outcome, but it would need a lot of support from outside and close monitoring internationally to see what happens with these people. But still, even if that happens, there will be many, many other refugees, Shia refugees, refugees from other countries, that these 3 main refugees receiving countries are not willing to host on a long-term basis. And for these, you need to create the open channels to Europe and the refugee protection regime in Europe that has miserably failed so far, and that, if we are optimistic, might still come about on a long-term basis.
We had 2 more questions, but I'm afraid that we are out of time. I also wanted to say a couple of things, but you will hear me later, I guess. So yeah, thank you everyone, and it was a great discussion.